I'm finding it quite difficult to understand why the government is increasing its regime of testing for the COVID virus. I saw a headline this week which said that the government now plans to test everybody, everybody twice a week, or at least to suggest that everyone has free access to testing twice a week so that we can ramp up the number of tests right up to, I suppose, the full population. Maybe 70 million people twice a week. That's quite an ambition, quite a task. And one has to ask the question, why would you want to do that? What's the reasoning behind it? Given the fact that we know that a large number of those tests are false positives. In fact, it's been estimated that between 1 and 1.5% of all the tests are false positives. That's an interesting statistic, because if you start to think about how many people you would be testing if you test everybody in this country, well, I suppose we're talking about getting between 60 and 70 million people, 70 million people at the tops on the outside. And to test those people twice a week, well, that's a huge number of tests, 140 million tests a week. That's a lot. And if we do say that, let's say 1% of that 70 million tests in a week is a false positive, what's that amount to? Well, that's 700,000. And if you were to say, well, let's not say it's 1%, let's say it's 0.5%, what's that? That's 350,000 tests would be positive or come up positive, when in fact they wouldn't be, they'd be false positives. That's a huge number. And it also provides the government with this the ability to say that 350,000 people have tested positive this week. Of course, it might even be twice that if you do testing people twice as much. The more you test, well, the more you find. And you may have to ask yourself the question, why would you want to increase those tests and find even more cases? Well, I've been thinking about that, and I may have an answer. I suppose the big thing that struck me about governments is that there's been a big change over the last 20, 30, 40 years. In the past, well, governments used to have principles which they used to canvass people about. It might be that, for example, they believed in a minimum wage, and they would say, because we believe in a minimum wage, we'll try and encourage other people to vote for us, and then when we get into power, we'll put that proposal into effect, and then we'll give people the minimum wage. So vote for us on that basis, because that's what we believe in. On the other hand, other people might believe in something quite different. They might believe in a small government, very little government intervention. And if you believe in the same thing as we do, then vote for us, and then you too can share our principles, and we'll put those principles into effect. And there'll be a battle of principles in the voting box. But things seemed to change, it seemed to me, when Tony Blair took office. I noticed quite a big difference then. What I discovered was that Tony Blair was not really a man of principle, he was a man of the focus group. And the difference was palpable. What it meant was that he decided that he would get focus groups together, he would ask them what it is that they wanted, and on the basis of what they wanted, he would then formulate his policy and his manifesto. If the crowds told him that we wanted this, that, or the other, then that's what he would put into his manifesto. So he wasn't so much putting forward the view that these are the principles I believe in, but these are the things which I believe will help me get into power. Well, it seems to me that many of the politicians that we have these days are not so much people of principles, but they're people of power. And if that's the case, they will do almost anything, even jettison their principles if they have any, in order to maintain that power. I saw a slogan on the side of a waste bin in Winchester the other day, and it said that governments never voluntarily give up power. It always has to be wrested from their grasp. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's a statement which went all the way back to, I suppose, revolutionary times maybe in Russia and other countries like that, but There's a lot of truth in it even today, in my view. The Coronavirus Act 2020 has changed the game completely as far as Parliament's concerned. What it means, that act, is that government ministers, the executive so-called, all those ministers can now make laws and guidelines and effectively run the country with exactly the same powers that the Parliament had. Parliament no longer has that because it's given that over to the ministers to make those decisions without any checks and without any balances. And what we find now is that we have a system whereby the government is being run by the executive and Parliament really has no say. Strange thing is that you might think that, well, perhaps they would do that only for emergencies. Perhaps that would be the situation which would only occur for extraordinary circumstances. And yet extraordinary circumstances seem to have come and gone. But the powers are still there with the government. The executive still controls the making of the laws, and Parliament has very little say in that effect. They've only just recently voted to extend those powers until November. And the betting is, as even members of Parliament have said, we'll be back here in November granting those powers an even longer period of time. The government didn't even want a sunset clause on them originally, and they were forced into doing so. So, coming back to COVID, why is it that we still have these laws? Why is it that we still have this control? Why is it we still have a kind of a lockdown? And the answer has to be, I suppose, to me, that because it's no longer about principles anymore. If your government is one that's concerned not about principles but about holding on to power and doing whatever it can to gain that power, then it seems to me that that's probably the explanation of why we're still in the situation that we're in, and that power hasn't been relinquished. If it was a matter of principle, then one would expect the government to go back to living by those principles. But if it's a matter of power, then one would expect the government to hold on to power for as long as it possibly can. And if you can tell those people that there were another 350,000 victims of COVID this week, well, then you have a perpetual excuse to be able to maintain power for as long as you like. For as long as you produce tests which will test 70 million, which will produce large enough numbers on a weekly basis to justify extending your powers almost indefinitely.